right on that now. And that sounds good. Thanks, John, for the prompt. I appreciate it. Well, part of the reason I wanted to know where folks were joining from is that this is the first time since I've arrived here in upstate New York that more than 2 or 3 of our congregations have gotten together to do something. And it's a really wonderful, I think, gift of pandemic, our invitation to join together and not only be able to learn from John Buren's, but also from each other. And so this summer, when the weather is nice, we want to build on a tradition that we've been doing here in Rochester between First Universalist and First Unitarian and have essentially a joint service. We want to have a revival this summer. We had a big tent with our 2 congregations, but if we're going to have 8 or 9 or 10 congregations, we're going to need a way bigger tent. And I'd love for us to find a central location. It'll be one Sunday. It'll be streamed to all of our respective congregations and into your homes, to your phone, but really good worship and a picnic. Nothing that wouldn't be more fun without all of you. So I hope that you'll all join us. And because we haven't done it before, I'll admit it's not in my congregation's budget. So we're hoping to raise a little bit of money just to seed this project. And so we'd like to invite you to give a small donation for the class, not a requirement by any means. We'll pay our lecturer an honorarium, but also be able to fund the ministry, the bridge between our congregations. It is truly a joy to be with all of you. And I am going to pass it to my dear colleague and friend, the minister of our downtown Unitarian Universalist congregation here in Rochester, First Universalist, the Reverend Lane Campbell, who will help us by lighting a chalice and gathering around some opening words. Welcome, Lane.
Thanks so much. It's a joy to be here this evening and grateful to be here with you all. I'm Reverend Lane Campbell. I'm the minister of the First Universalist Church of Rochester, right in the heart of Rochester's downtown. I want to invite you all as we get started this evening to just take a deep breath of arrival with me.
Oh, sure.
Let us breathe in and breathe out. Take a moment to get in touch with your hearts and your minds. If you have a candle nearby or a chalice that you yourself can light at home, I'll invite you to do so. And I will light mine here. This is my winter candle. I started using this during the service of this. And so I'm going to light our chalice this evening with these words from Sandra Fees, one of our colleagues in Pennsylvania. And we light this chalice and we read this reading in honor of our Transcendentalist ancestors whose work seeded our modern day environmental movement, which we'll hear a little bit about. But first we begin with a prayer for the earth. Earth, you are my body. O earth, for your lush body broken, for your living waters sullied, for your sheltering trees scorched, for your wild creatures pursued. For you in my distress I call out. I long for the breath of the wind and the dance of the sea to move what seems unmovable, to break us free from this silence that hangs in the air. Aching for a song of repair to liberate this land, I call out. You, earth, are my body. This planet, a sanctuary. This land, a garden. In my distress, who will listen? Who will refuse to be silent? Who will lament with me? Who will lift up their voices in sacred song and call out with me in distress to heal your earthly paradise? So this evening, we come together to join voices and to join in a long tradition of coming together to learn and to grow. And so I wanted, John, I am so excited to get to be here this evening and to get to be here with this group of people. And you were talking to me before we were gathering about the need to just kind of recap where we've been. And I would be extremely grateful for a little bit of a recap. I don't know about folks here, but just to kind of get caught up on what's been going on, what you've been talking about.
Yeah. So I never assumed that everybody's been present for all of these sessions. They have been recorded. They're available on the YouTube channel maintained by First Unitarian in Rochester. There have been some handouts that were put in the chat for those things, and I think those are going to be also available. One was a summary of the timeline of our Transcendentalist forebearers' development as a spiritual religious revival movement within Unitarianism and the anti-slavery movement. By the way, the whole idea of revival puts me in mind of the way in which our 19th century ancestors had the wisdom to come together in conventions. I think of the first African-American convention in Rochester in 1853, at which Frederick Douglass spoke, or Seneca Falls. The other thing that I did in the second session was about the often forgotten women in the Transcendentalist movement. Here I have to say, one of the points that I had to make was that often the Transcendentalist roots of the women's movement were forgotten, partly because of women in upstate New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, after the Civil War, you know, broke with Frederick Douglass and with most of the Transcendentalist women in the women's rights movement over the question of whether African-American men were going to get to vote before they did. They did not support the 14th and 15th Amendments. And that divided the women's rights movement in America for over a generation. Interestingly enough, in my book, Conflagration, how the Transcendentalists sparked the American struggle for racial, gender, and social justice, I point out that it was actually a male, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, often remembered only as Emily Dickinson's friend and editor, who brought the two wings together in the 1880s and 90s, and helped to put the drive toward women's suffrage back on the road again. The first session was really devoted to what we need to remember about the spiritual practices of our Transcendentalist forebears, because so many of them could be useful to us today. They kept a journal. Here's mine. It was regarded as almost essential that one keep track of one's own inner life in response to the events of the day. They wrote one another. They practiced spiritual friendship that transcended differences in social position, gender, social class, and even race. Boy, are those skills and those practices needed today in the most divided America that we've had since the run-up to the Civil War. My book is titled Conflagration because it borrows from Frederick Douglass's prediction that the 1850s, particularly after the Dred Scott decision, were going to result in the conflagration of civil war. God forbid that that should happen again in America. But we have to learn from our Transcendentalist forebears if we are even going to face into this difficult time that we are now living into. So those are some of the themes that I've covered in the previous three sessions: spiritual disciplines, the women's rights movement and the Transcendentalists within it, and the way in which our Transcendentalist forebears, although they did not start the abolitionist movement by a long shot, they certainly helped re-spark it at some very difficult periods and became some of the most radical members within it. We think of Samuel May. who's remembered in in the very name of a church in your midst. We think of Frederick Douglass himself, who more and more, I believe, is going to be treated as a Black transcendentalist, particularly in the latter part of his life. That term for the very first time was used by Peter Wiersbicki, professor at Princeton, in the title of a book that came out just this past year, since I wrote. So if you have any questions about spiritual practices, about the Transcendentalism movement in general, about the women's rights aspect of Transcendentalism, about their involvement in the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements, please feel free to voice those and put them in the chat tonight. At the end of my presentation, Lane's going to be helping to conduct the discussion, but I don't want this to be just about this evening's topic, because it's our last time together. My topic this evening really revolves around what we owe our Transcendentalist forebears in the way of openness to and study of the faith of others. And I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier than what is often called the Transcendentalist movement per se. I mentioned this in the book. In the 18th, it's very hard for us today to realize how deep-seated religious prejudice was in American culture. Puritan New England, historically, had done things like banish the Quakers to Rhode Island. They had a law on the books in Massachusetts that made it legal to shoot anybody coming over the border from Rhode Island. They were rabidly anti-Catholic. That was not the attitude of the great mentor of the Transcendentalist movement, William Ellery Channing, who grew up in Rhode Island, in Newport. When a Protestant mob burned down a Catholic convent in Charlestown in the 1820s, William Ellery Channing was the only Boston minister who stepped forward and condemned it as an act of religious bigotry and hatred. When Channing died in 1842, the Archbishop of the Catholic Diocese in Boston caused the bells of all of the Catholic churches in Boston to ring in mourning for William Ellery Channing, who interpreted the word Catholic with a small c in its original meaning, to be universal, to be inclusive. By the way, among his congregants was a now almost forgotten woman named Hannah Adams, a very distant cousin of Abigail and John Adams. Hannah Adams was, among other things, the very first person in America to actually earn a living by writing. And her most important book, which went through 4 editions, was called A Dictionary of Religions, because she thought that it was important that people understand the faith of others. And she did the remarkable thing of writing to people who were leaders in other faith traditions, not her own, to say, have I misrepresented you in any way? Is this what Swedenborgianism is all about? Is this what Catholicism is about? Rabbi, is this a fair representation of Judaism as you understand it? She wasn't the only Channing-influenced Unitarian, however, to take that kind of approach. I mentioned in our discussion of the women in the Transcendentalist movement, the much neglected figure of Lydia Maria Child, who is often remembered only for that little ditty, "Over the river and through the woods to grandfather's house we go." But oh my God, what an intellect. She was given, at least temporarily, access to the library at the Boston Athenaeum, and from it produced a book even more comprehensive than Hannah Adams's. One of the most amazing early studies of the faith of people from non-Christian traditions. Hannah Adams had, by the way, turned to people like the Unitarian minister at the East Church in Salem, William Bentley, for some help on some of her researches, because Bentley was one of the most astonishingly erudite people in America. He never married, but boy, did he study. He would ask ship captains in Salem, "If you're going to Marseille, would you bring me back a copy of that new French-Persian dictionary, because I want to learn Persian, Farsi." He eventually knew 19 languages. He was the only person in America in the early 19th century who was literate in Arabic. When Thomas Jefferson was George Washington's Secretary of State, and there were conflicts with the so-called Barbary states along the north coast of Africa, Bentley was the only person in America who could translate the correspondence from Tunis and Algiers. Jefferson tried to persuade him to become the president of the University of Virginia when he founded it. Bentley didn't want to leave his beloved Salem. So even before the Transcendentalist movement per se, starting in the 1830s with the formation of the Transcendentalist circle that Emerson, Frederick Henry Hedge, George Ripley, and others gradually expanded to include people like, well, Elizabeth Peabody comes to mind. She was one of the first women admitted. Why? Well, she ran the bookstore in downtown Boston where the Transcendentalists turned for all the latest in information about, well, there's a French translation of a Buddhist scripture. The very first publication of a Buddhist scripture in America is in the pages of the Transcendentalist journal, The Dial, with Elizabeth Peabody translating that French translation of the Lotus Sutra into English. Emerson was fascinated not only with the Vedas and the Upanishads, again, often coming to him in translations from European languages, German or French, or in some cases, directly into English. Because the perception of ultimate reality as perceived from a lens outside of the biblical was very much in line with what he was trying to do in insisting that we needed to be able to have a direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. You know, his very first book begins called Nature. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticisms. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation with the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us, and not merely the history of theirs. Well, as beautiful as that opening to Nature, published in 1836, is, and relevant, I'm always at pains to say that the reason I teach about the Transcendentalists today is that our age is not retrospective. It is, in fact, suffering from what I would call a massive case of collective amnesia. It is a vital effort on the part of people like, well, I'm in the midst of reading the 1619 Project. There is a vital need to revise the almost mythological interpretations of American history that many of us have been given. And to do so from a perspective that is outside the mainstream of the textbooks that many of us were raised on, almost all of which exonerate America of its two great crimes: the dispossession of the native population without so much as a by your leave, and the great original sin of America, the imposition of chattel slavery on such an important part of the population. That's why the 1619 Project actually says our myth of origin should begin with the arrival of the first Africans enslaved in Jamestown in that year. Well, these two themes of Transcendentalism's connection to religious perspectives outside the mainstream, outside the biblical, and the insistence upon nature as itself sacred, earth as sacred, come together, I think, in that same book that Emerson wrote in 1836, and that is the very first publication of the Transcendentalist Movement. It's the product of his trip to Europe, a trip that he took after he had resigned his pastorate as minister of the Second Church in Boston, an event that I am convinced was brought about not because he didn't want to serve communion, although that was the nominal reason. He'd come to believe that Jesus never intended for there to be a perpetual ritual of remembrance in bread and wine in his honor. And moreover, as it was done in Puritan New England, the communion service was like a perpetual memorial. It wasn't Eucharist, as my wife, the Episcopal priest, would say, which is a lifting up of thanksgiving, so much as a, isn't it sad that he died for us? And Emerson was going through the great grief of his life, the death of his wife, Ellen Tucker. After less than 18 months of marriage, she had succumbed to tuberculosis, which was endemic, and which, by the way, also he had. And he left the ministry, partly because she had left him enough of a legacy to depart from having a steady job. And he wanted to reinvent himself and reinvent the religious in a way that was more personal and deeply felt. Part of his grief involved actually going to Ellen's casket in a mausoleum and opening it to show to himself that she truly was dead. And when I approach his book, Nature, I am always reminded that the moment of revelation that he said came to him while on his trip to Europe was in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where he saw this immense display of all of the variety of the natural world. And he said to himself, I will be a naturalist. What I believe he really meant was, I will accept death as a part of nature. I will be a spiritual mortalist. Part of my evidence for this is in one of the most important later speeches of Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of his most repeated speeches. He gave it here when he visited San Francisco in the 1870s from the Star King's pulpit. It's his lecture on immortality. It is not an immortality of individual identity beyond death. It is an understanding that there is that in each of us, which in some profound sense never goes away. Call it an immortality of influence, if you will. Because Emerson was certainly convinced that part of our job in this life is to live as fully and as memorably as possible, to make a positive impact upon the world, to make a difference, to make justice. And that our immortality, like that of Jesus, will lie in the memory of what we have done on behalf of others. Didn't he say in the Divinity School address, one man, one human being was true to that which is in you and me? The willingness to live so vitally concerned for the well-being of others, insistent that the two great commandments are to love the ground of our being with all of our heart, mind, and soul, and then love our neighbors as ourselves. That, by the way, it gets lifted up by that other great transcendentalist, Theodore Parker, as what he called absolute religion. It has a spiritual dimension because we have to love being here in the first place, be passionately in love with life, and unfazed by its vicissitudes and even the politics and the challenges of day-to-day living. Maintain an equanimity and love of existence itself, that it can be the basis of our really reaching out and loving others. By the way, that late lecture of his, Immortality, ends with a parable borrowed from the Upanishads, in which a young Hindu teenager, he describes as the son of Gautama, as though this was the Buddha's son, who's not recorded in Buddhist literature. But this young person comes to the god of death and says, tell me, is there an immortality of the soul? And in essence, that parable dodges the question. As well, I think it should be dodged if you are truly wise. Does your soul live on? In Pasternak's great novel, Dr. Zhivago, who's a physician, turns from being just a doctor to a young woman dying of cancer to becoming sort of her priest. Your soul will live on, you know. Your soul is you in others, others in you. I believe the Transcendentalists understood profoundly that it is the way in which we influence one another while we are alive that makes our own lives influential, even after we are gone. To live intensely, passionately, engaged. We just recently lost one of the great spiritual leaders of our time in the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. This was his teaching as well, because this understanding of the meaning of human existence transcends particular spiritual traditions. Rabbi Hillel said that all the law and the prophets could be summed up standing on one foot. He summed them up very much the way Theodore Parker did. You love God, that is existence itself. And you love your fellow human beings. Well, I mentioned that clearly both Emerson and Elizabeth Palmer Peabody were reading the Upanishads and Buddhist scriptures like the Lotus Sutra and publishing them. Well, so were people like Henry David Thoreau, who comes in certain portions of his journal very close to saying, I'd be a Buddhist if there was any Sangha to be part of. He writes how plain it is that death is only the phenomenon of the individual. Nature does not recognize it. She finds her own again under new forms without loss. This is a reading I've sometimes used at memorial services. Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley, who didn't quite make it into the 6 women that I lifted up, but the remarkable Mrs. Ripley was part of the Transcendentalist circle, was treated in a biography by our own Joan Goodwin. She was married to Emerson's uncle Samuel. She was a tutor in many different fields. The president of Harvard in her time said that she was capable of any professorship in the college, although of course women couldn't even go to the college, much less teach there. But she struggled to reconcile spirituality and nature as much as Emerson did, and could not join her husband in believing in a traditional form of immortality, in which we just wait to meet one another on that beautiful shore. By the way, Emerson didn't discount the importance of living in such a way that might be, in some symbolic sense, really true. That we would all be together again. In other words, in that sense, he was a universalist, not just a transcendentalist and a Unitarian. And that remains true of many of the most important figures in the Transcendentalist movement, including the one who is the thread figure through my book, and who becomes the first teacher of comparative religion in the United States. I'm speaking of James Freeman Clarke. He started as the first Unitarian minister west of the Appalachians in Louisville, Kentucky in the early 1830s, and would go back to the meetings of the Transcendentalist Circle every late summer or fall from 1836 to 1840, when he finally moved back to Boston. He got terribly sick. Everybody in this book and in the Transcendentalist Circle had the tragedy of losing a loved one or becoming terribly ill themselves. Infectious disease was rampant. Tuberculosis was endemic. And Clarke himself nearly died in 1849 when he was leading the first Transcendentalist congregation in Boston, the Church of the Disciples, and he had to go back to his wife's home in Meadville, Pennsylvania, where her brother was leading a new Unitarian seminary, the first school for ministers west of the Appalachians. He spent his recovery teaching what he called ethnic religions, studying Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, the Chinese religions. The first teaching of the faith of non-Christian traditions in the United States at one of our seminaries. He kept studying these things, although it's interesting that James Freeman Clarke, founder of the Church of the Disciples, never ceased to think of himself as primarily a disciple of Jesus, as a Christian, as someone who was trying to live out the meaning of discipleship, of what Jesus really had in mind in commanding his followers to love God with all of their heart, mind, and soul, and love their neighbors as themselves. So it's not necessarily the case that the Transcendentalists leave Christianity. It's that they have an appreciative relationship with faiths other than that of Christians, that they are willing to learn from them, to be in dialogue and in a relationship. And after the Civil War, when Clarke was terribly tied up with, well, such things as launching the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, the Black regiment that's featured in that great movie well, now I'm blocking on its name. The one that stars Matthew Broderick and Denzel Washington. I think you remember it, about the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. That was a church project, by the way, for the Church of the Disciples. Members of the congregation were involved in recruiting. Lane, you were about to help me?
Oh, glory. I'm seeing.
Glory. Thank you. Of course. Because the other thing that comes out of the Church of the Disciples during the Civil War is Clarke helping his parishioner, Julia Ward Howe, write the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah. Well, after the Civil War, one of his first projects is publishing a series of articles in the Atlantic Monthly on 10 great religions. It's so successful and so popular that it becomes a book. And he keeps expanding it. It becomes a 2-volume treatise. It goes through 22 editions, 10 great religions. Clarke, in addition to leading his Church of the Disciples into becoming the largest Unitarian church in Boston, and one of the most engaged in social justice work, also becomes the first professor of comparative religion, teaching simultaneously at Harvard. You can draw a straight line between this Transcendentalist movement to events like the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893, organized by a man that I would describe, well, he was a Meadville graduate and a sort of Western transcendentalist, Jenkin Lloyd Jones, who becomes the secretary of that Parliament of the World's Religions. When I served as president of the UUA, one of the things that I came to realize was that we Unitarian Universalists at our very best, although never great in numbers, had our widest and deepest influence when we were the catalysts for interfaith cooperation, especially around issues of peace and justice. That we had done this not only with what became the International Association for Religious Freedom, which we started way back in 1900, But in 1970, Dana McLean Greeley started the World Conference on Religion and Peace with Homer Jack, a product of Cornell, as the executive secretary, of what is now called simply Religions for Peace. I became the honorary president of Religions for Peace during a critical time when religious leaders around the world needed to face down misuses of religion by people like, well, the patriarch of the Serbian Orthodox Church was backing Milosevic in what were essentially genocidal events like Srebrenica. We got the ecumenical patriarch of Eastern Orthodoxy, Bartholomew, to say, if you continue with that, I will excommunicate you. We got the Vatican to rein in the Croatian archbishop. This is a religious leadership organization, not a grassroots one. So it's not very well known. But you should know that we Unitarian Universalists to this day are terribly important in catalyzing interfaith cooperation around the issues of peace and justice, and social justice more generally. I think one of the great accomplishments of my tenure as president was actually working with Denny Davidoff, the moderator, to help fund and launch what became the Interfaith Alliance, the first really progressive interfaith religious organization in the United States, to face down the presumptions of right-wing religious people like the so-called moral majority, which never was either, or the Christian Coalition, which pretended to speak for all Christians and never did, and which just exploited misogyny and homophobia and racism as a way of selling their souls. I can't tell you how important it is today for us to understand that although religion has been given a bad name, the spiritual core of every tradition remains important, valid, and critical to cultural and intercultural progress. There never has been a successful social justice movement in the United States that didn't have a spiritual dimension. Think of the civil rights movement. In the 10 years after I served as president of the UUA, my work focused on the freedom to marry as a social justice cause for our GLBT sisters and brothers. When I first went to those meetings, I knew I was going there as somebody who could represent the best of our tradition, where we had already stood up as the first religious movement in America to say, it's not just blessings, spiritual blessings we want civil marriage rights and all the protections that go with that. I could go there with our participation at Selma behind me, with our participation in Religions for Peace behind me. These are vital things. And today, Religions for Peace, by the way, is also deeply involved, as are other interfaith cooperative efforts, in fighting climate change and global warming. So let me now turn a little bit back to Emerson's first book, Nature. and the contributions of Transcendentalism all the way down to today's environmental and climate change concerns. By the way, I think perhaps the first American to become concerned about climate change was none other than Henry David Thoreau. There are now studies of his careful measurements of changes in when trees would come into bud, birds would begin to appear, where he was already noting in the 1840s at Walden Pond and in Concord more generally, over about a 15-year period that he kept these records, that things seem to be getting warmer and spring arriving earlier, and the ice breaking up when it wasn't expected to on the pond. Some people have treated Thoreau's evolution as sort of a moving away from spirituality toward just empirical science. My good friend Malcolm Gladwell Young, who is the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, did his PhD dissertation at Harvard on the spiritual journals of Henry David Thoreau. Kind of remarkable for an Episcopalian, I think, but Malcolm is a very insightful fellow. And he insists that no, Thoreau, like Emerson, remains a spiritual being to the very end. By the way, you know that when Thoreau died in 1862, and again, tuberculosis was the major problem. There are several stories about him on his deathbed. One is that he was asked if he had made his peace with God, to which his reply supposedly was, "I wasn't aware that we had quarreled." Another question to him was whether he was prepared for the next life, to which his reply was, "One life at a time." Malcolm points out that in his lecture and later book called Walking, where Thoreau makes the remark, "In wildness is the preservation of the world," a phrase picked up, of course, by John Muir and turned into the motto of the Sierra Club and of the modern conservation movement. It's often forgotten that Thoreau was not making a conservationist remark so much as a spiritually based theological remark. He was talking about that aspect of the natural world which we human beings don't try to control and can't control. Now think about that for a moment. So much of the wildness of the universe that we dwell in is and always should be beyond our control. That wildness, I've seen in my own lifetime, has a capacity, if we don't suppress it, to renew itself. I lived on the shores of Lake Erie when I was a boy for a while, not far from the Cuyahoga River that was catching on fire. The lake was insufferably polluted. You couldn't swim in it. Finally, when we stopped treating it as a sewage plant, much of the wildness of that lake came back. The damage is there. But the capacity of nature to renew itself was very much at the core of what our transcendentalist forebears saw in the natural world and revered. Because, as I pointed out, they were a spiritual and moral revival movement themselves, eager to see people who had become overly materialistic renew their own spiritual commitment to living more authentically, more simply, more passionately, and more compassionately. So let me skip ahead to John Muir a little bit. I bet you didn't know that he was deeply influenced by Unitarians. He came out of a Calvinist background in Wisconsin on a farm, but he made it to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Didn't go all the way through and earn a degree, but the principal professors that he studied with there were all Unitarians who later became founders of the Unitarian Church in Madison. And the wife of one of those professors became a lifelong spiritual correspondent with John Muir, even after he moved out here to California. Now, he's often given credit for having saved Yosemite and starting the national parks movements. He doesn't quite deserve that. It actually goes back to an earlier authenticated transcendentalist, the minister in San Francisco, Thomas Starr King. Starr King had written a book of the poetry, legends, and landscapes of the White Hills of New Hampshire just before he moved west. And one of the first places he went when he came here to California was up to Yosemite. He actually was contemplating doing another book about the sublime character of nature that we often overlook based on the Sierras. He came up with sermons like Yosemites of the Soul, The Living Waters of Lake Tahoe, Lessons from the Sierras. He's a much better nature writer than I realized. I'm going to be co-editing the works of Thomas Starr King in the next few years, in line with the 200th anniversary of his birth in 2024. Thomas Starr King brings Transcendentalism to the West Coast. Among other things, he does the classic Transcendentalist thing of inspiring other writers and thinkers. There's a whole salon that gathers around him that includes people like the short story writer Bret Harte, who was a member of his congregation, and a photographer who is often forgotten named Carlton Watkins, who Thomas Starr King persuaded to go up and take the first big photographs of Yosemite that made it famous. Carlton Watkins, by the way, lugged a camera that was about 3 feet wide and 3 feet high. And there's very delicate plates that had to be exposed up there in the mountains. It's a huge endeavor. But those images of Yosemite were so dramatic that they ended up being exhibited in New York. Starr King had written back every week to the Boston Evening Transcript about California, letters from California, including descriptions of Yosemite and the Sierras. And by 1862, Ralph Waldo Emerson owned 10 Carlton Watkins photographs of Yosemite. Abraham Lincoln saw Carlton Watkins' imageries of Yosemite. And when Thomas Starr King tragically died at the age of only 39, again, infectious disease, combination of tuberculosis and diphtheria, in March of 1864, a movement started to do what Starr King had really wanted as part of his work out here, to preserve Yosemite in perpetuity for the public as a kind of natural inspiration of that which is so awesome that it should remind us that we should stand forever in awe of the creation and that mystery behind it. Within 3 months, my fellow co-editor Tyler Green has shown, within 3 months of Thomas Starr King's death, the Yosemite bill passed the US Congress. Now, how remarkable is that when the Civil War was still going on? June of 1864. It turned over the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa big trees to the state of California to be held in perpetuity as a place of spiritual renewal and recreation. John Muir doesn't get out here until 1870. But when Ralph Waldo Emerson preached that lecture on immortality from the Thomas Starr King's pulpit in 1870, he promptly, with the rest of his party, went out to see the wonders of the falls and Half Dome and all the rest. He spent an entire day with John Muir, who was showing him the differences between the different between coastal redwoods and sequoias, the various forms of pine, the wonders of the natural world. Muir very much wanted Emerson to stay overnight and continue with him this spiritual retreat before the sublime. Emerson's son, Edward, who was a physician, wouldn't hear of it. Took him back toward the city. It was an arduous journey, but there's this wonderful image from one of the members of Emerson's party of Emerson himself on his horse, hanging back after the others had gone over the rise away from the Mariposa Grove where he'd met with Muir, and waving his hand to Muir in a kind of benediction and blessing and thanksgiving. And then turning to one of his companions and saying, you know, I think he may be an even better naturalist than Thoreau was. Take the Sierra Club and run it way ahead into our own time, at least my lifetime. When I became a Unitarian minister in the 1970s, the practice of Earth Day, launched by Senator Proxmire of Wisconsin and the Sierra Club, and talks at various colleges around the country, was just taking off. I'm still looking for a young scholar to demonstrate that it was through the joint efforts of Unitarian Universalist congregations like the one I served in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the local branch of the Sierra Club, whose president was one of my congregants, that the whole annual celebration of Earth Day and the launching of what has now become a 60-year environmental movement in America really took off. God knows there's much more to be done. But without interfaith cooperation and without the reverence for nature and the conjoint realization that what we need to do has to be done in this lifetime. Another spiritual legacy of the Transcendentalists. I think we would be in even worse shape than we are today. And it's because they represent that awe before the transcendent wildness of the universe that should make us fall in love with it over and over again. That I think they are worth remembering, not only, as I put it in the book, for their contributions to racial, gender, and social justice, but I should have added to interfaith cooperation and the modern environmental movement. And with that, I think I will finally stop and allow Lane to see what you guys really want to poke at.
Well, John, thank you so much. Thank you so much for, I mean, all that you have given us to listen to this evening and to receive. I want to just invite us, all of us, to take a moment and to think back through some of what John has just shared with us over these last, 45 minutes. Perhaps something is sticking out to you from this presentation that you are wondering a little bit more about. Or perhaps there's something that caught your ear that you want to lift up here. You had some particular insight about and you'd like to hear some more about from John. I want to really invite us to think through some questions based on what we've been hearing here tonight. Has it been our practice for the most part to do this just in the chat, or have folks also been unmuting, John?
They sure can do that. It's up to you. Here I see a hand raised from Martin Hotfit.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. Martin, I'll give you just the floor in just a second. If folks would like to actually speak a question aloud, I'll invite you to raise your hand. If you don't yet know how to do that, it's the reactions button. I see that on the bottom of my screen, and there's a raise hand option there, and you can also go there to lower your hand afterwards. So, that would be a great way to know. So Martin, we'd love to hear your question. Thanks so much for starting us off this evening.
Not a question. Well, it is a question, but first, greetings from Sam Trumbore, the minister of my wonderful UUA church in Albany, as you know. In fact, didn't he serve as your intern?
No, but I vividly remember coming to, I think I probably preached at Sam's installation as your minister.
Oh. And my question is, you, during your presentation today, you said that the whole four-class thing had been recorded. Where exactly is that?
I'm going to defer to Shari to place that in the chat, so she will be able to direct you to. It's the YouTube channel for the Rochester Church.
Okay.
Thank you.
She's also posted, by the way, how to donate to this revival fund, and I commend that project to you. It's a general contribution to the Rochester Church, but you just add the note revival, and you can do it on their website through their donate function. Back to you, Lane.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for asking for that clarifying question. I would love to give John Jameson an opportunity to unmute. John, I'm seeing you in here twice. I don't know if you're a clone, if there's two of you, but you know how this goes.
myself.
Yeah, I think somehow you're logged in twice.
Yes,
John.
I got confused. I was trying to enter.
Yeah, you're going to have to, in order to do this well, you're going to have to cancel out one of those connections.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's going to echo through.
I got you, John. You should be okay now.
Great. Yeah, if you just unmute, John, you're muted, but if you just unmute, you should be good to go.
Am I good to go now? No, I'm not.
Still echoey.
There you go, John. I think I've got the right one of you in the waiting room. Try again.
Okay. Is this better?
Yeah.
It is.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that I put it in the chat box that when I think of transcendence, I think of my own experiences of hang gliding, which were beyond belief. And I don't know how that relates to the history of transcendentalism, but I can tell you from my own personal experience that it's amazing. I confronted my own death or the possibility of my own death, of course, but also the incredible vastness of the universe such as it was below me. And I can't do more than just say that it happened and it was amazing.
That's of course, I don't believe there was much hang gliding going on in the 19th century.
No, it started in 1883, if you really want to know.
Yeah. But it's interesting to me the way in which our transcendentalist forebears did get out into the outdoors in ways that they found similar. The number of mountains they climbed. Read Thoreau on his trek to the Maine woods, climbing Mount Katahdin, which is the highest point in the state of Maine. By the way, he's taken there by Native American guides. It's the one positive encounter that he has, I think, in his life with indigenous people. All too often in Walden, it's like he's being just nostalgic about how they were in the woods there at one time. But I said when we were talking about this, that this is one of the real sadnesses of that period. There was a kind of resignation to the disappearance of the indigenous people that pervaded the whole time. The other thing that Thoreau was adept at doing was going boating. And there's this sort of, you get out there on the wind, you're going with the flow. You've given up some control. Thoreau was very aware of the water as a place where that could happen. There's a new book out about him simply called The Boatman, which is a wonderful evocation of his relationship with the rivers that come together in the town of Concord. The Assabet and the Muscataquid come and form the Concord River, which in turn goes down to the Merrimack. And he and his brother did 2 weeks on the Concord and Merrimack rivers, and that was the book that he worked on when he was in his little cabin at Walden. He also was often down at the shore, either at Cape Cod. He investigated shipwrecks there. Again, this real standing before the wildness of the world. And when Margaret Fuller tragically died in the foundering of the brig Elizabeth, coming back from Italy in 1850, the ship crashed on the beach of Fire Island, just outside New York. Emerson sent Thoreau down there to hunt for any remains. Neither Margaret nor her husband were ever found, just the body of their baby known as Angelo. Although it's possible that Thoreau found some remains of someone who had been partially devoured by a shark and had the good taste not to say that that was Margaret. But I mention these things only because it seems to me that what you got out of hang gliding was that sense of awe before that which we can't control.
Absolutely.
And that's what I think is so often overlooked about the transcendentalist relationship with nature. That there was awe before that which we cannot and probably should not try to control. So in that sense, you know, that some of the tendency among the early religious liberals was to sort of domesticate the divine. Nice Father God. Emerson and Thoreau push against that. And their sense of divine transcendence is tied up with their awe before the natural world.
We had a question earlier from Amy Stockwell, John, about how do you see interfaith cooperation happening now with respect to both Black Lives Matter and voting rights movements? And maybe is there anything from your research or your writing that might support?
Yeah, well, I think actually in racial justice terms, there's quite a lot of interfaith cooperation. The Poor People's Campaign and William Barber leap first to mind. And that's had some continuity going all the way back to the civil rights movement. We forget, because we're in an age of amnesia, that it was Unitarian Universalists who were asked by Dr. King to bring the interfaith presence to Selma. It was Dana McLean Greeley who called John Cardinal Wright of Pittsburgh and called Eugene Carson Blake of the National Council of Churches and called the Orthodox Patriarch to all march with him on the Pettus Bridge. Dana was the catalyst for that interfaith cooperation. And that continues to be the case. The Interfaith Alliance, by the way, probably would not have survived if Denny and I hadn't called the board of the UUA into an executive session and given them an emergency loan when they were just escaping the clutches of the Democratic National Committee. You can't build an authentic interfaith movement on a partisan basis. And the Interfaith Alliance had been started as a project of the DNC, and it was going to die a secular death. And Denny recognized that we had the capacity, again, to, while she had identified a brilliant leader who was a Southern Baptist minister, who was deeply devoted to the same ideas of religious pluralism, basic human rights, and cooperation across differences that we have always represented at our best. And we got this emergency loan from the UUA in order to launch the Interfaith Alliance. I think it still remains a vital witness to the fact that the way forward in a pluralistic democracy like ours has got to be truly interfaith and not with people. Well, you can get some perverse forms of interfaith cooperation. I think about my battle with the Boy Scouts of America, where I was up against the Mormon Church and to some degree the bishops. And this was all about their exploiting homophobia. And the same thing went on with Prop 8 out here in California. The Mormons and the Catholics and some evangelicals forming a right-wing alliance against the advancement of human rights. There has to be a progressive witness on these matters, because it's my conviction that at the core of all authentic spirituality, there is a respect for that which is in me and in you and in you. That's the core of the transcendentalist moral ethic. I cannot fully realize my capacity as a human being unless I am concerned about the fulfillment of your full potential. That is why they promoted free public education and so much else, the women's rights movement, anti-slavery. It is that ethical imperative, which I trace back to Immanuel Kant as a source of the Transcendentalist movement in Germany and then here in America, that I think is key to them.
Well, John, I have a question. One thing I was wondering about a little bit more specifically was what this actual interfaith, collaboration and engagement looked like. What I was talking about a little bit was about teaching about other religious traditions. And, one of the things that I think about in Unitarian Universalism specifically is about, ways that we straddle oftentimes like appropriation and appreciation. And some of the roots there are in, of course, comparative religious studies.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what that actually, does this mean that folks were in community with people of multiple faith backgrounds, or does this mean folks were learning about this stuff but only talking in their communities? I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, well, I think in the roots of transcendentalism, you're just opening up to, oh, these folks have a spiritual life too. They may phrase it quite differently. They have an ethical life. So by the post-Civil War period, you actually get anthologies emerging by people like Moncure Conway, who was a Southern-born Unitarian abolitionist transcendentalist, ends up leading a congregation in South London where they use this interfaith collection of readings. Trying to remember exactly what it was titled at the moment, but it won't come to me. So that's one level. Mm. Spiritual inspiration. Mm. Here in San Francisco, our congregation, as Shari probably recalls, participates in interfaith activity at two other levels. One is that when the earthquake in 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake hit, our congregation played a leading role in bringing together all of the religious communities of the city in a new interfaith council to provide shelter, practical help for the people who had been rendered homeless. There's a whole network. We're just about to start next week of doing our annual duty of housing homeless people in our sanctuary and in our center. So we do that. But then we're involved in what I would call interfaith political action. We're engaged with a group that is an offshoot of one of the leading faith-based community organizing networks, PICO, called Faith in Action Bay Area. And Faith in Action Bay Area works from the grassroots up with, say, Hispanic immigrant Catholic communities and African-American communities and Jewish communities, Muslim organization and Unitarian Universalists, and literally now over 80 other congregations on a commonly agreed upon set of policy recommendations. We don't realize that things like Obamacare had roots in interfaith cooperation. The first iteration of that model for extending health insurance to people more broadly with public subsidies behind it was Romney Care in Massachusetts, although Republicans tend to forget that. It's actually a fairly moderate, sort of doesn't put the insurance companies out of business. It just brings more people into the network of insurance with public subsidies. How did that come about? That came out of congregationally based community organizing in Boston. I was part of it.
Mm.
So when you ask, what does interfaith cooperation look like? It can look like all kinds of things. It can be mutual spiritual inspiration. It can be cooperation around what I would call community service, but it can also be interfaith cooperation about maintaining basic human, democratic, and political rights.
Well, I want to give Tom Himmel an opportunity to ask a question since his hand is raised next. I also see Rev Sherry's hand is also up. So, but first, Tom, we want to hear from you.
Thank you very much. John, I'm joining from a church you've been to, which is First Religious Society in Newburyport.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I had a delightful time there.
Yeah, when I was there that evening, it was a great time when you came to talk about your book. And of course, we know that Thomas Wentworth Higginson is not just the publisher of Emily Dickinson, but he was briefly the minister there and was forced out of the church after about 2 years in 1849, which was
Right.
not to the congregation of that time's credit. And
well, like so many other congregations of that time, Tom, the ship captains of Newburyport were heavily involved in various forms of trade that was easily threatened by some of the ethical concerns that the Transcendentalists were bringing.
Inspired by this series, I recently secured the book White Heat, which you've mentioned before, which focuses on both Higginson and Emily Dickinson. And it happens to mention that Higginson's wife at the time, his first wife, spoke very disparagingly of the congregation here. And where I'm going with that is the Unitarian. I've been a UU for, I'm going to say 7 years, something like that. I came up through other torturous religious paths. But the Unitarian Universalist denomination and practices, as I see them in different congregations, is much more aligned with where I hear you seeing the Transcendentalists as having been in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm curious about is, did the Transcendentalists play in some fashion a role in moving the UU, which was of course just Unitarians at that time, not UUs with the Universalists, but what kind of a role did the Transcendentalists play, if any, in sort of moving the denomination to the place?
So they start, Tom, as a spiritual revival, spiritual and moral revival movement within the Unitarian churches. And I would say by the end of the Civil War, they've won. That is, by that time, the very things that they were challenging have been generally accepted. So even before the Civil War, James Freeman Clarke is elected the executive secretary of the American Unitarian Association. That was the functional equivalent of president of the UUA at the time. And by the time that they really organized all of the congregations in a general conference in 1865, the Transcendentalists, the broad church Transcendentalists, are in the leadership. Now, there were some radical Transcendentalists who wanted to go even further and didn't want to cooperate with that. But their Free Religious Association, which I talk about toward the end of my book, while it was an interesting intellectual exercise for a lot of important individuals, never really had much spiritual bite. Kind of was like the Ethical Culture Society, in that by refusing to engage with religious traditions, it was a plant without deep roots. And our Transcendentalist forebears, like I think contemporary Unitarian Universalists, can only thrive if we value the roots. Yes, were they transformative? You bet. Almost all of the practices that we take for granted today, women in ministry, lay people, more deeply engaged than just being passive listeners, everybody being involved in the major decisions of the congregations, the commitment to human rights. These all go back to the transformations that went on in both Unitarianism and to some degree in Universalism in the 1840s and 50s. It is our fault that we forget that. Because, and as I say, I think we need to value our roots. I see one last question in the...
Tom Elliott, we want to hear from you.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to reinforce your emphasis on the religious nature of this movement.
Yes.
No, I always refer to Martin Luther King Jr. as Reverend King,
Yes.
not Dr. King. Everybody remembers his sermons. Nobody remembers his dissertation.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly right. And most of us learn about the Transcendentalists, as I said in the first lecture, as though they were writers and individualists, because we read a little Emerson, we read a little Thoreau. Somebody has been reading Moby Dick, and was Melville a Transcendentalist? And the answer is yes. Although he was like Nathaniel Hawthorne, somebody who resisted the tendency among some Transcendentalists, including Emerson, I would say, to be a bit too overly optimistic about human nature. If there's one thing that Moby Dick is designed to do, it's to also show the dark side of human existence. And the whole thing is basically a parable about a ridiculous quest to stamp out evil, the white whale, to destroy it. It's not going to happen. Ahab is a vengeful sort of reformer, if you will. The Pequod is a ship full of people of all backgrounds, South Pacific Islanders and African Americans, Native Americans, and it's a metaphor for democracy, the ship of democracy. It's sort of curiously all male, but then that's what ship crews were in the time, and so was citizenship. Women didn't acquire the right to vote in this country until the 1920s, but again, there was that push toward the equality of all that lies behind the Transcendentalist movement. Where does it come from? It's a spiritual religious quest. And one should never think of them just as writers. There are people. They gave us the heritage that we have to carry on today.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for your question. And John, I hope that you're able to just take a look in the chat here and to see some of the words of gratitude and appreciation that folks have been sharing. And I'll invite folks to keep on just sharing some different words of appreciation and gratitude for this gift that John has been sharing with us this entire time, these last few weeks. I apologize, that is my computer. So we really just want to invite folks to offer some appreciation, offer some thanks. And John, do you have any sort of parting thoughts or last pieces you want to leave us with at the end?
One of the things I'm scrolling through the chat, being grateful for people even correcting me when I misspeak. I meant to say Gaylord Nelson and associating him with Earth Day and not his colleague, Senator Proxmire. My family has roots in Wisconsin, and I should have known better. And I'm just very grateful for all of you. I do hope that you will take the time, not just to take a look at my book about these people, but each chapter leads you on to some other wonderful writing that's out there about particular individuals, whether it's, say, White Heat and the friendship, the remarkable friendship between Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Emily Dickinson, or many other lines of inquiry. There's great new scholarship being done in the field of Transcendentalist studies. Great new books coming out. There is a film about the Transcendentalists that I'm told will emerge in the next year or two from the great director who did that film Boyhood, and I'm now going to block on his name. But pay attention to what's happening in Transcendentalist studies. I now co-chair the Unitarian Universalist Studies Network, which continues the work of the UU History and Heritage Society. And if you're at all interested in participating in more studies of the roots of our own movement and critical thinking about it, I urge you to go to the new website for the UU Studies Network and become part of an ongoing network of people who are trying to revive the self-awareness of our religious movement as one of historical depth, critical thinking, and a great future. And with that, I think I'll just thank all of you, and thank you especially Lane and you, Shari, for pulling together this opportunity to discourse on the roots of our heritage.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for this time. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for all your different questions and for the ways you participated this evening and in the sessions that have come. This will be available for folks to be able to watch on First Unitarian's YouTube page. We also just want to invite folks, encourage folks to make a donation to our revival fund as we are planning for a fabulous revival this upcoming summer, and a revival of Unitarian Universalism. Wow. So thanks everyone. Take good care. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Glad you were here.
Yeah, thank